How's it, Digital Beanie? My name is Rod Modlin. I'm a cloud solutions architect here at Tangent Solutions, and I've spent the last 10 years helping my clients get to grips with the digital workplace. Specializing in Microsoft, I help people with content management, business process management, adoption and training programs, everything you need to get the most out of your investment in Office 365. I'm joined today by Rufaro Warinda.
Hello, my name is Rufaro Warinda. I'm a modern work cloud analyst at also at Tangent Solutions. I have a background in industrial engineering. I've spent most of my career as a business analyst with focus on modernizing company processes according to best practice.
And today we are here to talk to you about information management in general and specifically POPIA. To start off with, we need to define what we mean by information management. Very simply put, it is how a business manages the information of its employees and its business. It is the strategy, process, and implementation of an organization's control of its information. This includes the collection, storage, curation, and communication of this information. It could be documents, images, databases, any source of information. A business's lifeblood is its information about how it does business, how it interacts with its clients, who those clients are, who its employees are, how they interact with each other. This is all information that the business relies upon to run, and it is the basis of information management. How do we control this information and make it available to our users? There are many different tools we have in information management, and we'll talk a little bit about that now. To start with, what are the artifacts, the pieces of information that we are controlling? Could be information in the form of spreadsheets that our business uses to capture data. Could be documents on file shares, or in the worst case scenario, only on the local files of local machines of our users. Could be information in the form of databases from our systems that run our business. This information could be tied up in enterprise content management systems that we have implemented within our business, such as a SharePoint. The information we're talking about also includes email, communication between the users within our business and externally with our clients. Similarly, it could be chat messages, again, either between our users or externally to the company. All of this information makes up the intellectual property of our business and is core to how we do business. So it is important that we have a view of it and can manage it in a real way and know what is happening, when, and where this data is. The data, all of these different pieces of data, could either be on-prem, so you are running it on servers that are managed and maintained by your business, or it could be hosted in the cloud, such as in Office 365. Often, there is a hybrid approach to this, where some of the information is housed on-prem and some of it is in the cloud. Additionally, if we have not gone through a digital transformation, some of this information might still be in physical media, in physical files that are within the business. And that also forms part of a good information management strategy. So we have all of this information, both on-prem and or in the cloud. How is it that we manage all of these? As I said, there are a number of tools that businesses typically use to do this. Traditionally, there are many knowledge management, as it is known, tools to manage the information. A file plan is a very important thing. It lets you know where your information is and what it is. This is also supported by naming conventions to make sure that documents are correctly named and entered into the file plan. And access policies make sure that we know who has access to what information and sensitive information is kept secure. All of these things together, and many others, make up an information management strategy. When we are building an information management strategy, we face a number of challenges. We'll go through a couple of them now, talk about what these challenges are and how we can address them. The first one I want to discuss is discoverability. Once we have all our information, no matter how well maintained it is and cataloged it is, the core principle is that that information needs to be available to the correct people. If nobody can access the information, it is not usable. So it has to be discoverable. Traditionally, the way this was surfaced was by browsing. We might have a file share that we're sharing to our users, and a user would go into the file share and click through the various folder structures looking for the documentation they need. This can be a very slow and laborious process and is not guaranteed to have the correct result. I might not find what I'm looking for. If that's the case, I then need to phone one of my colleagues who knows where it is, and they need to take time out of their day to tell me where it is or show it to me. This obviously is less than optimal and less effective than other ways of doing it. In the modern world, in the modern content services space, a much preferable way to do this is via searching. So rather than browsing for something, we can search for it. Much like in the modern internet, we no longer actually browse the internet, we search the internet. Using Office 365 and tools like SharePoint Online, we can tag various documents with metadata, which is information about the document. And then when we are searching, it can surface those documents for us, that information for us, based on those tags. In this way, we can make our documents much more discoverable. The next challenge I want to talk about is reliability. Once I have either browsed or searched for a piece of information, how sure can I be that that is the correct information and the most up-to-date information? To give an example, let's have a little bit of a thought experiment. Let's say I have a document I'm trying to build and I need to collaborate on it with some of my colleagues. I will first draft the document. So I go and I write it out, and I now have one version of this document. I now need somebody else to collaborate on it with me. In that case, I will traditionally email that document to them, and they will make their changes. Once they've done this and emailed it back to me, we now have two versions of the same document. As long as I'm very careful about my version control, that can sort of work. But now I need a third person to collaborate on this. So I email it to a third colleague. She works on it and then sends it back to me. We now have three different versions of the same document. This can continue many, many times. And what we end up with is many, many versions of the same document. So even if I browse to the correct place within the file share and I manage to find this piece of information, my level of confidence that the document I've found is reliable has got to be very low, because there are many, many versions of this. In modern content services, we remove all of this by creating what we call the golden record. So Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, all of these things have a built-in version control within the platform. So when I draft a document, I create that document once, and I then share that document to those colleagues, and we all work on the same document. We have a history of what it is, but when I'm searching or browsing for a document, I only ever find one document, and I can be very sure that when I find that, it is the golden record and I know it is the most up-to-date document. As we just discussed in reliability, part of that is sharing. I need to share the information that I have with my colleagues and potentially ask them to collaborate with me. Internally, that can be handled manually, as long as we are very strong about our internal controls and our version control. But as soon as we start sharing externally, it becomes much more difficult. The way we would traditionally do it is via email. The users I'm collaborating with or sending information to are not within my local network, so I need a different way to share it to them. Traditionally, I would email this out to them, and then we are back to the same problem that we have just discussed, where we have multiple versions of the same document. Additionally, once I have emailed out this document, I no longer have control over who has access to this document and what they are doing with it. In modern content services, we can facilitate that sharing through the cloud, through the sharing functionality in Microsoft Teams, SharePoint Online, or OneDrive. I can share that document out of that location to external users. And in that way, they only have access to that information through that share. And I can control how long they have that information for and what they can do with it. We can make it read only, and we can revoke that access at any time. So we have much more control over that sharing and who has access to it. Speaking of control, the next challenge is security. When we are talking about the information of our business, it is very valuable. Especially, we might have some especially sensitive information that we want to share, both internally and externally. And how do we make sure that is secure and we know that only the correct people have access to that for the correct amount of time? There are many different pieces that go into securing your content, and here are a few of them. The first one is identity management, making sure that users logging into our systems and accessing our information have a known identity. In Office 365, we use Azure Active Directory to maintain a single point of identity for all of our users, and we can manage that identity centrally, and all the different pieces of Office 365 talk to that one piece of identity management. It's a lot easier for users as they have a single sign-on into our environment, and it's much easier for our document controllers and our IT staff to maintain those identities. Following on from that, we have group management. We can add our users into groups and then apply permissions and policies based on those groups. This facilitates the management of security and makes the load on business a lot lighter. Third point I'd like to point out here is the need for multi-factor authentication. There has been a lot of talk recently on cybersecurity and the need to ensure that the identity management of your users is as strong as possible, and a part of that is multi-factor authentication. So rather than just having a password, enabling them to use something like a biometric or a one-time PIN to ensure that the person logging in with those credentials is the correct one and maintaining the integrity of that identity. The last challenge I would like to discuss is shadow IT. Shadow IT is the idea that we have pieces of technology operating in and for our business that are not controlled by the business. When our users have the need for a certain piece of technology, either external sharing or chat messaging, quick communications, if the business does not provide that functionality for the business, for the users, they will make adjustments and they will find other solutions for that. This could mean users sharing information through personal Dropbox or Google Drives, even OneDrives, or sharing information over platforms such as WhatsApp. In these ways, we have information leaving our business that we have no control over and no insight over from our business. So getting a good handle on what shadow IT is operating within our business and working with users to move them over to a solution that is manageable by business is quite important. That has been a couple challenges that we have with information management for business and how we can address them using the M365, O365 platform. Now I'm going to hand over to Rufaro to talk us through POPIA and what that means for us in this context.
Great. Thanks, Rod. I think before we get into the nuances of what Microsoft has to offer in terms of helping organizations manage their business, I think it's important that we get or gain a better context into the Act itself and what essentially POPIA is. Now, in layman's terms, POPIA is essentially South Africa's Data Protection Act. Now, what that essentially means is that the Act is aimed at protecting personal information, and the definition that we have set out here states that POPIA aims to protect personal information, and it states that POPIA protects natural and juristic persons such as people, companies, trusts, and closed corporations. Now, to distinguish between the two, between natural and juristic persons, natural persons are you and I, any regular person, and juristic persons can be described as companies, body corporates, or trusts. Now, how governance works in the corporate space, or how it should work in organizations, is you'd have legislation sitting at the top, legislation being the law of the land, standards that come below that. This now refers to GDPR, ISO standards, for example, and you'd have policies and processes that sit right at the bottom. These being your company processes, your policies, and any type of application or system that you may use on your day-to-day business processes. What is personal information? Now, personal information is what the Act sets out to protect. Now, this is the sensitive information that your organization needs to pay mind to when dealing with various individuals in your organization. Now, these can be distinguished as medical records, educational information, race and gender, contact information, financial information. I think this is an important one because it yields the highest penalty. Specifically speaking to financial information, we have account details, account numbers, anything that's identifiable to an individual or a juristic person. We have employment and criminal history as well. And a step below that, we now have special personal information. This speaks to ethnicity, further health records, biometric information, affiliations. These could be union-based and criminal behavior. Role players in the Act. And I think these are essentially important because this essentially highlights where you stand with the Act and what your responsibility is depending on what your role essentially is. So in terms of the data subject, this is the person whose information is about, the information that the person is collected from. The responsible party, in most instances, this will be the organization itself. So the responsible party is the one that is liable to the information regulator. So this is essentially the most important role player, I would say, in terms of what the Act requires. And then you would have the operator. The operator, an example of an operator would be a third-party service provider who requires personal information from the organization to fulfill their duties, for example, an IT vendor. And essentially, their liability is held on the basis of their contractual agreement with the responsible party. Now we're going to speak about essentially what constitutes as lawful processing and what attributes to lawful processing. So speaking to accountability, as I mentioned before, the responsible party is essentially accountable and liable to comply with POPI. Processing limitations, the responsible party must have a good reason for processing personal information, for example, consent, purpose specification. The data subject must know the reason why the responsible party is processing their personal information. I think this is quite an important point in the sense that the data subject must always know and understand what information they're disclosing to the responsible party and go through the conditions of what the responsible party would like to process their information for. Further processing limitation. The responsible party must ensure that if the personal information is processed again, it must be used for the original purpose. Now, this seems like quite an easy sort of regulation or condition to adhere to, but in many instances, you have organizations that circumvent or supersede this. Now, essentially, what this means is that once you've collected someone's personal information, you cannot store it in a database and use it for a number of different purposes. If you wish to use it for a number of different purposes, you must pursue the consent of the data subject before each time. For example, if you're essentially building an application and that requires account numbers from your data subject, you must request permission before you do this. If you would like to use the same information to store contact details of your data subject, you must require their permission to do this as well. Moving on to information quality, the responsible party must ensure the personal information processed is accurate and complete. Openness, the responsible party must process personal information in a way that allows the data subject to know what is happening to their personal information. Security safeguards, the responsible party must provide appropriate and reasonable security measures for personal information. This is quite an important one. We will discuss this in the coming slides about what Microsoft has done essentially to help organizations improve their security safeguards. Data subject participation. The responsible party must communicate with the data subject about processing and must allow data subjects to correct or update their information. All right, now we've gotten to the point where the law has required us to comply to POPI, and organizations are finding it really difficult in the sense of what do I need to do to implement the measures, conditions, and controls that require me to comply with the Act itself. Now, you'll be happy to hear that Microsoft has done quite a lot of the heavy lifting here, and we're going to get into this with a little bit more detail. So essentially, the tool that has been provided by Microsoft is called Microsoft Compliance Manager. Now, Microsoft Compliance Manager combines the realms of security, compliance, and identity management, and provides organizations with various roadmaps, controls, and conditions to get them to comply to best practice standards. Now, in South Africa, we have the privilege of having our POPIA Act that has been templatized by Microsoft, and each of the requirements and conditions of the Act have been laid out for you as an organization, which I think is pretty cool. So when we speak to Compliance Manager itself and its relation to POPIA, it takes the 8 conditions of the Act and it takes further controls and mitigation measures that you can have on your tenant in order to comply with the Act. Now, the different action types that are set out may be operational, maybe documentation-based, or they may be technical. And each of these conditions and controls can be assigned to different roles or different responsibilities within your organization. For example, you may have a security personnel who's responsible for cybersecurity, like Rod had mentioned earlier on. There will be technical controls assigned to that resource. You may have a resource who's responsible for human resources and collecting the personal information of your employees. Those would essentially be operational. And then you may have a legal representative who's responsible for the organization's compliance to general legislation across the board. This creates a central platform to be able to assign all of those roles and responsibilities. And if you don't have those roles and responsibilities defined in your organization, it lays out what that particular control requires and gives you a roadmap basically on what Microsoft recommends you do. Moving on from that, I think speaking more to the technical controls, there are a number of various controls that can be set in place to govern most of what Rod had spoken about earlier on in the webinar. Essentially retention policies, for example, with OneDrive, where you can essentially set how long you would like your documents and files to be stored in a specific location. This is quite an important feature because the Act does require you to set out a retention period and only use personal information for a period as what is required for its purpose. You have data loss prevention. This essentially stops sensitive and confidential information leaving the organization. This information could include financial figures, account numbers, personal information, ID numbers, quite an important one. You have sensitivity labels. The implementation of sensitivity labels allows users to apply controls or define policies to in-process or working documents. And you would have something like multi-factor authentication as well, which also prevents access from unwanted users or preventing viewership from unwanted individuals. Another great thing about Microsoft 365 Compliance Manager is it gives you a holistic view of the business's compliance to a particular regulation. So if you would like to essentially comply to POPI, it essentially gives you your controls and your implementation actions, and it measures that by means of a percentage. And I think it's important to note that once that percentage reaches 100% on your tenant, it's not to say that you are fully compliant. Compliance is not a destination. It is essentially a journey, and it's essentially ongoing. So don't panic if you haven't gotten there yet, and also don't get comfortable if you think you've arrived. I think that's very, very important. It's something that needs to be continuously monitored and continuously kept. So moving on from that, we're now looking at the nuances of what are in-scope services. As you can see, Microsoft Compliance Manager has a plethora of influence. It reaches across multiple applications and multiple systems, from Exchange Online right the way through SharePoint and Teams and various other smaller applications. I think that creates a great background and a great platform for you to be able to manage your business and essentially to keep to what the legislation requires of you. And once you've attained and achieved all of that, Microsoft creates an audit record where you can upload documents, you can upload information to support the fact that you've achieved and reached certain requirements within the regulation.
Thank you for that, Rufaro. That was very insightful and full of very relevant information for everybody. I'd just like to reiterate there, as Rufaro said, these are not one-time actions that we have to take. This is not something that we can do once, push a couple buttons, run a simple program, and have everything covered from a governance and compliance and information management standpoint. This is a continuous journey and a continuous task that we go through in order to maintain the information management and our compliance for the business. Thank you all so very much for joining us. We're going to have a bit of a Q&A now. So if you have any questions, please do let us know, and we're happy to talk about them. And if you want to get hold of us in future, please do drop us a line. Thank you so much for joining us.